Hospitals. Somewhere that I'm sure few of us want to go, unless absolutely necessary. Their walls haunted by the horrors experienced whilst inside, and the countless souls that have passed away within their confines. These places are not somewhere I want to explore alone, so please join me in welcoming fellow horror narrator Creepy Blonde Girl on our hospital tour. So get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I worked in a dementia unit of a retirement home for a while, and I can tell you that it was by far one of the most interesting jobs I've ever had. It was sad in many ways, of course, but I think what some people don't understand is that we'd never known about our residents before the Alzheimer's or Lewy body or whatever. We just know and care for them as they are. Even some of the most advanced cases are able to demonstrate that they are unique individuals who enjoy life and need love and belonging like everyone else. That said, strange things happened every day. I'd say the strangest and most unnerving would be what happened with a resident that I will call Nancy. Nancy had very advanced Alzheimer's, to the point where we had not heard her say a word beyond incoherent mumbling for about 6 to 8 months. Every day, she would just pace the halls until it was time for bed, as pacing is a very common behaviour with moderate to advanced dementia. In Nancy's case, she pretty much never stops unless we made her come and eat something. We would commonly try to walk and talk with her, just to keep her stimulated, but she would hardly even look at us, just pace. Nancy had a husband that also lived in the community. This home had a section for dementia separate from a normal assisted living facility. Her husband Wayne lived in this other section. He would visit his wife every day until he himself became so sick he was confined to his room. When this happened, we started to grow worried. Even though it sometimes doesn't seem like it, frequent visitors make a big difference to even our most advanced cases. Nancy and Wayne had been married for over 60 years. It was undoubtable that even through her disease, Nancy still received some comfort through Wayne's visits. I suppose we need not have worried. Wayne died early one morning. We, as well as most dementia care units, have a policy that prohibits bringing negative energy where it would not do any good. So Nancy was not supposed to be told of Wayne's death. Later that day though, during her usual pacing, Nancy stopped, stared into the upper corner of the room for several minutes, and then all of a sudden started screaming. Now this isn't as alarming as it may seem. There was a lot of screams happening all the time in dementia units, but it made all the staff come to see what was wrong. She abruptly stopped screaming, and I swear by everything I hold dear, she started repeating her husband's name. Wayne, 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 over and over. Keep in mind she had not said the smallest word in almost a year. I got up to touch her on the arm and ask her gently if everything's okay. Nancy looked straight at me, which was also very abnormal for her, and she says, "He's bothering me. Tell him to leave me alone," then goes back to staring into the upper corner of the room. Half of the staff just nope out of there, whilst the rest of us tried to get her distracted by giving her a snack and a different activity. From that day on, she started talking again. Nothing lengthy, but she would occasionally start to talk to either us or herself. Many times she referenced someone called Grandpa, and started speaking to him in an otherwise empty room. While this isn't an uncommon thing for our residents to do, the fact that it did not start until the exact day her husband died still gives me serious creeps.
Not a doctor, but used to work the 911 line at night, which resulted in numerous interesting tales. Here's one. Most nights were long and boring for me, as the phone didn't ring much, and I was mainly in charge of the fire department dispatch, as that's where I worked, and I was just doing a rotation in there, but I was still on the 911 line and coordinated with other agencies, police, medical, so forth. Often I'd come in, hook up my 360, and kick back for the night, dealing with maybe a few calls that amounted to a whole lot of nothing. So there I am playing Fallout 3 when the 911 line goes off, and I answer without any problem. 911, state your crime or emergency. Hello? I was just attacked by 2 large black men who beat me, mugged me, and then cut off my penis. I just sit there in silence for a moment, trying to process what I just heard. Sir, I'm sorry. Did you just say they cut off your penis? Yes, they did, and mugged me too. I'm in desperate need of medical attention. By now, I'm sounding up all kinds of alarms to get everyone rolling, because this is going to be a long one. Sir, I'm going to need your location so I can get you help. Do you know where you are? I'm not sure. I'm in a lot of pain, and there's a lot of blood. I think they still have my penis. Now, I'm trying to see where the call is coming from, but unfortunately my system isn't registering a location. I'm on the other line with the police, who are giving me the address while I'm still trying to talk with this guy. I'm getting your address now from the police, sir. Help is on the way. Just stay on the line with me until help arrives. Thank you. I'm so embarrassed by this. By now, I'm kind of in disbelief that this guy is so collected, but figure it is just shock, and it hasn't quite hit him yet. Out of nowhere, I hear him start making this weird groaning sound, and then he hangs up. I dispatch out the call as a sensitive nature and get all crews rolling when I realize the location is directly across the street from the hospital. I try to call the number back, but get no answer. However, the 911 line rings again, and it's the same guy saying the same thing and starting to sound a bit more panicked, wanting help. I try to keep him calm and can hear the sirens in the background, but this only causes him to freak out more, and I can't really understand what he's saying anymore. Finally, the medical crew finds him, and he's naked from the waist down, and apparently messed himself while sitting on the floor, and beyond that was unharmed. Apparently, he was a demented patient from the hospital across the street who woke up in the middle of the night, put on a shirt, and somehow wandered outside. Then, when he became lost, he called 911 and thought someone cut off his penis.
I took care of a lady once. She nearly died of sepsis, which is a blood infection, and she had multiple strokes and coded multiple times in the ICU. They'd given her Lidafed. Lidafed, or leave 'em dead, is what we say because Lidafed shunts blood from your extremities to your vital organs, usually resulting in necrosis, death, of peripheral tissue. This means that when she came to me, her fingers and toes were all black. She wasn't quite right, and I've seen lots of crazy, but she truly unnerved me. She never spoke, only whispered in this bright bubbly voice like a little girl. But she said awful things like, "Can you push me outside so that I can chew my fingers off?" And she would smile all the time. She also had some really bad pressure ulcers from just basically being immobile for so long. We had to dress her wounds daily, and she usually ripped the dressing off pretty soon after we put them on. One night, I went into her room and saw a piece of what I thought was dressing on the floor. Upon a closer inspection, it was a chunk of her own skin, a partially healed skin graft to be exact, and it still gives me shivers.
People turn batshit crazy and creepy as hell when they get really sick. There's even a term called ICU psychosis. And trust me, it's real. Anyway, the creepiest that takes the cake for me is this. I'm an ICU nurse, by the way. I had a patient who was admitted for an overdose. Very long history of mental health problems. She was thrashing around in bed, very combative, kicking people's asses for days, totally incoherent. Well, the night I had her, she started making decent sense, but still not oriented at all. She was extremely paranoid and kept talking about the man in black in the corner. I'd hear her talking to him and screaming all night long. So I'd go in there and try to calm her down, but you could see the fear in her eyes. She was talking other nonsense about how she was in space and shit, and with certain patients, you try to redirect their reality, but what I did didn't help. She said, "That man in black, don't you see him?" and pointed to the corner. I said, "There's nobody there." I stepped in the corner she was pointing to and waved my hands around. While I'm waving my hands around in the air, she had the most horrifying, terrified look on her face that actually scared the shit out of me. It was like I just had assaulted the man in black. I said, "See, there's nobody here." And she said, in a matter-of-factly, "you stupid dumb bitch" kind of way, "That's what you think." I promptly got the fuck out of there.
I was a certified nursing assistant for about 8 years before the stress of the job destroyed my lower back. I worked in a memory card facility. We handled everything, from the early stages of dementia to the end stage Alzheimer's. We had around 30 patients all living together under one roof, and a normal night was anything but that. Yelling, combative patients, poop, so much poop. But when someone was dying, the other patients seemed to sense it, and it was calm, so calm. And on this particular night, a gentleman who I had taken care of and built this amazing relationship with, and become what the family described as his unofficial grandson, was on his deathbed. I would come to check on him to make sure he was comfortable, and give him a dose of morphine from the pain. Did vitals on him each time, and I could tell he was failing fast. With his daughter and his son in the room, I knelt down on the bed and held his hand and said, "Bob, we're here for you. We love you and it's okay to go." He ever so slightly turned his head and winked at me, something he would do when he would tell me a joke or make a comment that went over the other patients' heads. He gripped my hand hard with his giant farmer hands. I cracked a joke about how I wish I were a young and beautiful nurse doing this instead of a 6'4" guy, and he chuckled. I checked his vitals and he was going. I was taking his pulse and I could feel it slow. Then, nothing. I heard his last heartbeat. It was surreal. I could feel the emotions rising in me, whilst I closed his eyes for the last time. His daughter knelt down and hugged me from behind and we both sobbed. After what seemed like to be forever, we stood up and I made the call to have a doctor come and verify the time of death, and to have the body removed. I wasn't in the right state of mind because I'd lost someone that I had been so close to. After all the craziness of the night died down, and he was gone, and I had talked to his daughter and she left, whilst I was sitting alone at the dinner table, and two of the other residents walked up to me. This is the creepy part. These two believed they were married, and thought it was still the Reagan era, and even in a good day, they were pleasantly confused. They came out of the living area to sit down next to me. They said that I did a good job, and then when it's their turn, they hope that I'm there for them too. That moment of clarity from two people slowly losing everything to Alzheimer's. That moment stuck with me as creepy, yet heartwarming.
My mom works in the local ER, and she sees a lot of interesting stuff. I'm relaying the stories she's told me. Once, there was a guy who'd been stabbed, who was being wheeled in, and he was still in shock, so he wasn't really feeling the pain yet. He was eviscerated and was holding his intestines, trying to push them back in, and the docs and nurses had to restrain him from trying to do so he wouldn't damage them further. To anyone who's had bile drains like me, this will make you cringe. A guy in prison has end-stage liver failure and has external biliary drains. These are drains that are screwed into the bile ducts in the liver. He gets into a fight with another inmate, and the other inmate grabs the patient's bile drains and rips them out. Jeez, just typing that makes my stomach hurt and sympathy pain. I had bile drains for the same reason for months on end, and just the slight accidental tug on them hurt like holy hell. A patient came in with a large abscess that requires lancing. The doctor goes in and starts injecting lidocaine to numb the skin before cutting. As he's telling the patient just about done with the shot, boom! The abscess explodes all over his face. He's wearing glasses, so his eyes were protected, but everything else got splattered with pus and nastiness. He promptly excused himself, walked to the supply closet, and grabbed a few bottles of rubbing alcohol, and proceeded to get into the decontamination shower and dumps the bottles all over his head. He said it took many showers to feel remotely clean again. Ugh, so gross. There's also a frequent flyer who's a very large gay man. He's always coming in complaining of rectal bleeding or bloody stool, so the doctors are forced to do a rectal exam. When they do this, the guy moans and basically gets off of the digital check. Really creepy and gross. So of course, the head doc sends in a resident or newer techs as a joke. One guy came back and flipped them all off, yelling, "Fuck all you guys!" And my mom at the desk with all the docs and nurses bust out laughing. Last one for now. There was a couple who did some drugs together. I think it was crack. The guy beats his girlfriend to death, and they're both brought in. The guy is cuffed to the bed, while the team works on trying to save the woman. Meanwhile, all this guy can do is bitch about how hungry he is and demands a food tray or a turkey sandwich, standard hospital issue. Eventually, the head doc goes in and tells him to shut the hell up, and that they're not a restaurant and they don't owe him shit. It was pretty satisfying for every staff member in the ER.
I am a former critical care and ED nurse. The two stories, both of which occurred at a large Houston hospital in the mid-1980s. This is my first story. The emergency services bringing a young man about 25. He is in a decerebrate posture, stiff hands, impartial fists. which turned out indicating deep brain damage, and being manually bagged. As he came in the door, he was not intubated. According to the emergency services, his significant other had found him in bed with another woman, either drunk or deeply asleep. She carried a .25 caliber pistol with her, and the reports was that she placed the weapon directly against the patient's skull and pumped around 10 rounds into his brain from various angles. The rounds were powerful enough to enter the skull and bounce around, but not to exit. All higher brain function was destroyed, but automatic functions remained. We intubated him, or inserted him into a breathing tube, and placed him on one of those old Barney Bear ventilators. Very primitive by today's standards. This caused the patient to buck, to fight against the ventilator with deep coughs. When he did so, the pressure within his head increased, and little fountains of brain matter would be expelled from the 10 holes in his skull. One hit me in the face. I was pretty well protected by clinical distance at the time, but I must admit this really got to me. There was nothing really that could be done for him, other than supportive care, and he died a few weeks later from a massive infection. The other story I have is about another young man that agreed to be mummified in a rather extreme sexual practice. Essentially, he was placed in a full-body plaster, covering even his face, and was given breathing tubes through the cast. Other than that, he was fully encased in the cast with the exception of his toes and genital/anal area. My understanding was that this extreme degree of helplessness was considered erotic. The normal practice was to use a cattle prod or some similar device, rectally, to force ejaculation. But in this case, either through ignorance or malice, he was directly connected to 220 volts with one probe in his rectum and the other probe on his foot. He had third-degree burns all over his entire genital and perianal area, deep burns on his foot, and the smell, severe burns everywhere. Blood, feces and serious fluid was leaking from what had once been his rectum. We tried to remove the cast to see if any degree of rescue were possible, but by the time it was even partially off, it was clear he was quite dead. All of us just stood there with our mouths open, utterly unable to say anything. The police that came there too were mute. I volunteered to remove the entire cast and rendered some level of post-mortem. I found deep lacerations over much of his body, deep bruising, and quite a few other burns. We sent the body to the medical examiner, and I spent the rest of the shift trembling and vomiting.
I was interning at a local clinic when I was younger, and I had the opportunity to sit in on a 1-year-old cat getting spayed. Now, I have a pretty strong stomach, and I've seen stuff like that before, but I was not prepared. Now, the surgeon was a real fun lady. She was all about showing me the real side of being a vet. Fair enough, because to be honest, it sucks, and there's a lot of nasty stuff you see/do. She opens up the poor cat and announces that she's pregnant and asks me if I want to see the babies. Gross, I thought, but why not? I poke my head over and she lifts out the womb. Terrible looking stuff. She points out several lumps along it and tells me that those are the fetuses. She places a small incision above one of them and then goes to squeeze one out when pop, not a fetus, but a long, big stream of pus comes spraying out of the womb right up into the surgeon's face. She freezes. The assisting surgeon starts frantically getting this shit off of her, and I get to witness the greatest string of profanity I'd ever heard from a woman her age. Turns out the poor cat had pyometra, an infection of the womb that went undiagnosed and looks like an undeveloped pregnancy. Fun day. Got to go home early while they cleaned up. Don't worry, the cat was absolutely fine. After she cleaned off her face, she finished removing the tissue and got the cat on antibiotics. Edit, spayed, not neutered, and I decided not to be a vet.
I have a couple of creepy experiences that I can share from my 3rd year of medical school, which is when everything is still new to you, when you have no idea what to expect or how to handle some of the stuff. So, psych rotation at the State Mental Hospital. We went in to evaluate a middle-aged woman with a history of visual hallucinations and erratic behaviour. Through most of the interview, she looked at the floor and responded slowly with one-word answers. Very flat effect and clearly schizophrenic, but not really endorsing any of the symptoms that brought her to the hospital. All of a sudden, I'm thanking her for her time and about to leave the room. She jumps up and grabs the lapels of my white coat, surprisingly hard, and pulls, and gets right up into my face, close enough for her breath to fog my glasses. I didn't say a word. I just had the most intense look of fear on my face, and she just stared right at me, breathing hard. I froze. I didn't know whether to push her away or to say anything, and I had no idea what she was going to do. It lasted maybe 4 seconds, before other staff came to help. But those few seconds were absolutely terrifying. This following incident happened at hepatology rotation, which for non-medical folk is the liver disease service, mostly alcoholics with cirrhosis. Cirrhosis is a rough disease and is eventually fatal without a transplant. Alcoholics tend to not qualify for transplants, in general because most of them won't stop drinking, and don't have adequate social support, and are too deconditioned to do well after the transplant, and we only want to give our short supply of organs to those who will get the most medical benefit. You don't want an alcoholic to get organs, keep drinking, and not get out of bed after the surgery, only to die next year anyway, or scar up the next liver from alcohol abuse. So anyway, most of the patients I saw were in that situation, with bad symptoms and no hope for a transplant. Most of them had severe hepatic encephalopathy as well, which is delirium and confusion because of basic metabolic toxin waste that builds up and affects the brain because the liver can no longer get rid of it. I remember one patient who was really out of it, couldn't even get words out, just grunts and moans. He didn't have long left, and the family had just decided to stop treating the disease and make him as comfortable as he could so that he could die at home in peace. I walked in that morning to stop and get some meds, get him ready and send him home to do my physical discharge, and he's sitting up and eating a bowl of cereal looking lucid. It surprised the hell out of me. He normally couldn't control his movements at all. No way this guy could manage to eat cereal or hold a spoon. I cautiously asked how he was doing today, I hadn't heard him utter a word the whole month he'd been there. He'd been on my service, and he said, "I'm dying soon. I haven't got a lot of time." My jaw about hit the floor. Then he was out of it again. He dropped the spoon and spilt the cereal all over himself. I figured the lucidity was some sort of freak occurrence, and I went to their bedside to examine him. Halfway through the exam, he stops groaning and looks lucid again and says, "Well, I'm out of here," and then immediately slumps back into a V-fib arrest. I think about that moment every time I have a dying delirious patient. I'm always half expecting some crazy moment where they become lucid and call their own death like that. I always wonder how he knew, or what feeling he had to make him say that.
I'm not even a doctor, so this most likely isn't relevant. But I've spent months of my adolescent years in the city's children's hospital, incarcerated in multiple wards, most prominently the psych ward. After 9 p.m., there are nurses on guard duty patrolling each dormitory in case anybody tries to escape and harm themselves during the night. The dormitories are very small, only 4 rooms holding up for 2 people, so it's particularly impossible to get past the guard. Regardless, I kept my door locked. At around 3 a.m., I'm awoken from my slumber by breathing. I disregard it, assuming that it was my roommate, before remembering that my roommate had left the day before. Nope, it was the fucking manic-depressive bipolar girl who managed to sneak past the night watchman, unlock my door, and watch me sleep. I have no idea how long she was there for, but she just smiled at me and then backed out of my room like nothing happened. When I woke up, there were tiny shards of plastic and glass all over my floor. That place was fucking mental. No pun intended. Edit. Another story. When planning our activity for that day, a nurse named Henry, not his real name, deemed ice skating too expensive. This really upset the bipolar girl, who wanted to go ice skating really badly. Later, we found a piece of paper on the dining room table which said, "Ice skating. Kill Henry. Kill Henry. Kill Henry," sprawled in felt tip all over it. She also had narcolepsy, so I took revenge by taking photos of her napping in class at every opportunity.
I work as an emergency medical technician. A few years ago, I came across the most horrifying thing I've ever seen. So to set the stage a bit, in the middle of August, and it's over 90 degrees outside, or 32 degrees Celsius, with 70% or higher humidity. Really miserable conditions outside. We get a call to help the police with a welfare check. Basically, the police knock on an elderly person's door to make sure they're alive or need help. This was after the neighbours had gotten worried about an over 90-year-old woman who lived in the house. She hadn't been seen in about 2 or 3 weeks. The responding officer checks all the doors and windows and gets no response. So we pull up the contact info from my last visit to her house. The young Go-Hung rookie cop got the okay to break in to check. So he goes to break down the door, he runs up and kicks it, and slips as he gives the kick, and falls into a bush. He finally got it right the second time and knocked the door. Meanwhile, me and my partner are laughing our asses off at him. The next moment he sets foot in the house and turns right around. He was stopped cold by the smell. That's when we knew we didn't have to find a patient, we had to find a body. So, a little more background to the environment. This house did not have air conditioning, and was sealed up tight. No windows were open or anything. Add in the temperature outside the previous months, and you have an oven for a house. We were walking into a house that had a dead person sitting in it for over 2 weeks in an oven. So we go inside and the most horrific, eye-watering smell hits us. It's undescribable how bad it was. We could taste it, it was so intense. The only words I have for describing it was airborne death. So whilst we're gagging and trying to search the house, we finally find her body. She'd been taking a bath and somehow managed to die and fall into the water. Think bony, festering maggot soup. And that's what we saw in the bathroom. We took one look and noped out of the house. I still have nightmares at that sight. And the smell. The smell comes to mind whenever somebody talks about the smell of death.
Not a doctor yet, but I used to work in assisted living. I had this one patient who would consistently ring her bell at night, just over and over. She hardly ever needed anything, just rang it because it was there. But sometimes, at night, I'd go in and she'd be sitting up in bed, in the dark, waiting for me to come in. And she'd tell me I needed to get her husband out of the room because she didn't want him there. Her husband had died years ago. Obviously, there was no one in the room but her and me, but she'd tell me where he was and ask me to make him leave. He's sitting right there in the chair. Tell him he can't be in here anymore. So I'd look at the chair and tell the invisible dead husband that he couldn't be there anymore. His wife prefers that he leaves. She'd do this not super often, but often enough that I would get a little freaked out about her room. One night, I came down the hall after she had rung her bell, and before I could get there, I can hear her yelling, "Nurse! Nurse! Nurse!" She hardly ever does that, so I'm a little nervous, and I go in, and she's yelling, "He's under my bed! He's under my bed!" and staring at me with these wild, terrified eyes. And I fully admit right now that this was absolutely not my finest moment. But for 2 seconds, I got this wave of panic, and I just said, "Just 1 second." And I stepped outside her room to the hallway because I just could not deal with it. At which point she starts fully screaming, terror panic screaming. And I decide I can't just stand here in the hallway while this little old lady is terrified in her room. So I take a deep breath, barge right back in there, and demand, "Okay, where is he?" And she yells, "He's under the bed! He's all bones!" So I go over to the bed, kneel down, and say, "All right, you heard her. You've got to go." And I keep telling him he's got to leave until she calms down and says he's gone. So, on one hand, this lady might have a weird, undead husband who was haunting her room, but at least he had the decency to leave when he knew he wasn't wanted.
I work in security, and I'm often assigned to sitting beside bedside hospitals when it's a difficult case. The situation often includes drug addicts, people close to death, or the many patients that need constant surveillance. My shifts are usually 12 hours long, and I can't really exit the room until it's all over. I realise this might not be as hard as what medical professionals have to deal with, but this job has ruined me. This one time I got called to watch over a man who had started vomiting blood in copious amounts. Back then, I was somewhat inexperienced and could strike a conversation with the patient if he was coherent, mostly out of boredom, but it also helps me be on friendly terms with the patient if they prove to be difficult. He turns out to be a fisherman and a lifetime loner. As the evening drags on, he starts insisting on getting his sleep medication. Halcion and Xanax, I think, and the nurse complies. This repeats every 30 minutes, and the benzos obviously are not working. 3 hours later, the man is on the maximum allowed dose when accounting for what was obviously a decade long of abuse of benzo, and he's still quite conscious. The situation is getting weird. He would black out for 30 seconds and then violently shake, snap out of it and start yelling at me and the nurses for more medication. He's not getting any, and the situation cools down in the following hours. and he appeared to have resigned to the fact that he wasn't getting any more. At this point it's 3 in the morning, and the room is dark. I've got my back facing the window, and the only light in the room is a faint glow of a street light. The man had stopped talking and was lying in the bed with his eyes wide open, staring at the wall opposite him. We hadn't said a word to each other in a while, but suddenly he turns to me. Our eyes meet and he whispers, "I watched my father kill himself." Then he describes to me in intricate detail how his father had come home from work, sat himself down on the couch and shot his own face off with a shotgun point blank, with his wife and son in the same room. He looked at me straight in the eyes, and I remember the orange glow of the streetlight reflecting on it, a stare colder than anything I've ever seen. He told me how his mother had lost her mind after the tragedy and hung herself in her home. He had to cut her down. He stayed up for the remainder of the night, and we stayed silent. When I bid him farewell in the morning, he didn't reply. People dying beside me, horrible accidents, crying families, and the stories of many unfortunate drug addicts have all impacted me. But, as I sit over the unfortunate, this is what sits with me. I can't escape the room even today. I still think about how his life must have been. Every night alone with his horrible nightmares, reliving the scene every time he closes his eyes. The years of benzo abuse, severe depression, and panic attacks. I wonder why he didn't follow in his father's footsteps.
When I was working as a nurse at an Ebola clinic in Liberia, most of the patients that had Ebola and died didn't hemorrhage much. A little vomiting and diarrhea, but nothing of hot zone level. Except for this one guy. It was myself, a Liberian sprayer, and a Liberian nurse. We suited up to take a man out of the back of a Liberian ambulance, a pickup truck with a covered bed and a washable mattress. This guy was in his early 20s and was in poor condition. He crawled onto the stretcher we had laid down for him. He was sweating profusely, and his eyes were already blood red, the blood red of a man ready to die from Ebola. He didn't speak any English, just a spattering of capelli and moans. He rolled onto his side and vomited. A slow, gelatinous mass rolled out of his mouth, black as 1,000 moonless African nights. It left his body. Thick as an apple, it rolled out of his body and spattered against the canvas of the stretcher, covering my Tyvek suit from the knees down in dark blood. For those 2 seconds, when it was leaving his body, before it splattered on the stretcher, it was alive. It was Ebola incarnated. We washed the man off with 0.05% bleach solution and took him inside. We did an Ebola test and pushed 1 liter of fluid and 1 liter of oral rehydration salts. This perked him up. He sat up, asked for food, and ate a generous portion of tofu. We thought we had managed to turn things around, that he might make it. Unfortunately, he died in 2 hours. I still can't look at Jello today without thinking of him.
I'm not a doctor, but a care provider in a home for developmentally disabled adults. A long-time client whose mentality/interests were comparable to that of a 4 to 6-year-old would cover his head with bedding when he would go to bed. The staff would playfully ask him what he was doing, and he'd tell them that he was hiding from the ghosts. He never identified the ghosts, and did this for years, so staff always thought that it was just the client being playful. At one point, this client didn't want his normal routine like eat and drink, stay up and watch television, or use the restroom. Whilst bathing, the client said he was seeing ghosts and pointed. The staff asked, "What ghosts?" And the client said it was his parents, and that they're going to take him home. Staff gently reminded the client that his parents had already passed away, and that they couldn't possibly take him out that weekend. Within 72 hours of telling staff he saw the ghosts of his mum and dad, that client went into the ER, was admitted to the hospital, and passed away. I was the one that had spent half the night in the ER with the client. I had taken him to the ER before, and other routine medical appointments. This client was known for being rather combative during such visits, but was unusually peaceful the entire time, and the last time he went to the ER. When I went to the client's memorial, I told the client's family that I thought he knew it was his time based on how calm he was. I didn't disclose the part about seeing ghosts of his parents shortly before the ER visit.
I had a patient who was dying from DIC, but we didn't know it at the time. Another nurse and I were in her room chatting with her. She suddenly grabs the other nurse's arm and says with a terrified look on her face, "Laura, tell that lady to leave." The other nurse looks around and says, "What lady?" The patient looks at her and says, "The lady with the white hair, standing by the IV pole. You don't see her? I don't mind the little boy that comes in with his ball, but she's really scaring me with that horrific look on her face." The hospital I work for has a long list of sightings of a little boy playing with a ball by the back elevators at night, where the pediatric ward used to be. Another time, on night shift, a patient puts his call light on. One of the LPNs goes in to see what he needs. He tells her a lady was just in his room asking for food, and when he told her he didn't have any, she disappeared out the window. The LPN jokingly says, "Well, next time you see her, you ask her her name." The next night, the patient puts the call light on again. The same LPN goes in. The patient reports the same exact thing and says, "She said her name was Julia." The LPN reports this back to her night shift coworkers, and everybody realizes that that's the room that the patient who stayed with us the longest, over a year total, which is unheard of in an acute care unit, had been in. Her name was Julia, and she was always asking us for something to eat because she was always hungry. She had a major digestive tract issue that kept her on a clear liquid diet for 90% of her stay. She had finally been discharged to a long-term care facility and ended up dying a few months after she got there. Apparently, she wanted to come back and visit and harass us for food one last time.
I'm a paramedic. We got a call to go out to a scene for an elderly woman with chest pains. We arrive at the house, and the front door's open. We knock, and we hear the woman calling out from the back, "I'm in the back room," in a very calm voice. My partner and I go to the back of the house looking for this woman, and that's when we smelt it. Nothing prepares you for the smell of a rotting corpse. I've smelt it a dozen times, and it never gets any less disturbing. We radio for police and ALS backup as we move through the house. We opened the door to the master bedroom, and there's our patient. She's approximately 80 and she's staring at the master bathroom with these cold, dead eyes. She never once looked at us as we approached her and began speaking to her. I got to the bedside and got in front of her gaze. She looked right through me. I turned around to see what she could be possibly looking at, and there was the source of a smell. A man around the same age as my patient is on the floor, with very little left of his head attached to the body. A shotgun lay on the floor next to him, and most of his head was strewn about the walls and the bathroom counter. We loaded the woman up into the ambulance, and our police backup pulled up. I don't think that woman blinked once the entire time she was in our care, and it totally messed me up today.
I was on ER duty during the final leg of my internship, and I must say, we get to see a lot of messed up cases every day. But there's one that stood out to me. It was around 11 in the evening, and we've had a really busy night, when all of a sudden, an elderly lady and a 22-year-old guy comes in. His hands are trying to stop the flow. No, fountain of blood spurting from his neck. There was so much blood everywhere. The residents tried to save the guy, but it was too late. He lost so much blood. He died, I think, 20 or 30 minutes after entering the ER. Police arrived at the hospital sometime later, and from what I heard, the recently deceased guy was a graduating college senior. He was just closing up his aunt's, the elderly lady who was with him in the ER, store, when 3 drunk and really high guys came upon him and decided to break a bottle of beer and shove it down the poor guy's neck. Saddest and most grotesque experience I've ever had in the ER.
So there had been a creepy lady who wanted to eat my soul. That was around a month ago. So yesterday it had been about a month and a half since then, when, lucky me, had another seizure, and this time I stopped breathing, and was rushed to the hospital. This time they told me I have a super rare brain disorder called Hashimoto encephalopathy. I can't be treated for it due to other medical conditions. I was put on a ward where people who are basically brain dead are placed, and I was waiting for a transfer because I wasn't going to stay in a unit with brain dead people. When I got my transfer, I was staying on a teen unit. I had a few visitors. I was sitting in my room with my headphones at full volume when someone knocked on my door. I thought it would be my nurse bringing food, but no, it was that lady. I sat there in shock and I wanted to run, but I had cords attached to me and I couldn't move. I was too scared. The woman said, "Hi Ashley, have you missed me? I've come to see how your soul is doing, and when you die, I will eat it." I sat there frozen. She started walking around my room, while the whole time I sat on my bed petrified. She sat in the chair just staring at me maliciously. I asked her to leave, and how she knew where I was, since I had gotten a transfer after all. She stood up and started to come towards me. She reached her hand out and grabbed my neck, and started making a horrific sucking motion. She started to put her mouth on me. I screamed and pressed the emergency button, and I knew I wasn't supposed to press it since it was there for the nurses to press, but I didn't care. About 7 nurses came in thinking I was in a life or death situation, and they saw the woman and took her down to the floor to get her off me. They called the police and took her away, and this is what scares me to this day. That day I had been drinking a Coca-Cola, and after she left, I continued to drink it. Not soon after, I started to feel very, very sick, to the point I became unconscious and was rushed to the trauma room, where they had to put me on full oxygen and medication to stop me from dying. The woman had tried to kill me. Thank goodness I was already in a hospital. Otherwise, I may have ended up in a morgue. I came very close to death. I was so close that I had an out-of-body experience. Thank goodness I survived. I still lay here in bed, scared to death. I think she's going to come back, and I still haven't been moved rooms. I'm scared.
When I was in my 3rd year of medical school, I rotated in geriatrics. As many of you know, most of medicine isn't saving lives. It's a lot of taking care of the dying and elderly that's just knocking on heaven's door. Anyway, I had a census of maybe 5 patients. 4 of them were goners with severe dementia. I was checking on this one guy who would say the most random shit all day long. For example, I would ask, "How are you feeling today? Are you feeling any better?" And I would get, "I really think cucumbers are the devil." One day, as I was listening to his lungs, he looked deep into my eyes and says, "I'm dying from the inside, and I know it. I don't have long left to live." Pure 100% lunacy. I was a little taken aback and checked with him and said, "You what?" He went back to stating, "I like taking pictures of shells. Don't you?" Short-lived, but the 5 seconds he was all there was incredibly creepy to me.
Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I would like to extend a huge thank you to Creepy Blonde Girl for helping me with this video. Let me guess. You're thinking this is the end of the video, and now you're gonna have to find something else to watch. But whoa now, for I have the solution. Creepy Blonde Girl and I have 20 more stories of horrors in hospitals over on her channel. You see? We got you covered. Click the link on screen now or in the description to follow us over. I'll see you there.